What is up, everybody? Solomon here. Super excited to be with Genfinity, interviewing a multitude of builders across Web3. This is one of the bucket list interviews. Really excited, and have to give a huge shout out to the Hashgraph Association for helping us to put this one together. But I can remember deep diving into PwC a handful of years ago when I was still doing all my YouTube videos. But super excited to have Husen Kapasi, who's the PwC Europe blockchain lead, with us today. We're going to be diving deep into real world adoption of crypto and blockchain technology. I always like to start these out with a little bit of an intro, though. So, Hussein, if you could give us an intro, background, and maybe a little bit of your role within PwC before we kick off here, that'd be great.
For sure. First of all, thanks to Hedera Hashcraft as well as to Ryan, for inviting me for this podcast. Really pleasure to be here and, share some insights on the projects that we do. I'm Husen Kapasi, 7 years at PwC now and leading on the blockchain topics. Have done a number of projects, enterprise projects, I would say, where we really talk about the application of this technology in industry. And I have worked, on cases with the businesses, from strategy to the implementation, roughly more than 12 industries now. So you name it, from gambling industry till oil and gas, we have experienced everything, right from the management to the techies. We have worked with all the levels, really understanding what is really the potential of this technology and how we can actually bring it mainstream, right? So happy to share some of the insights. I have done some very, very fascinating projects across different industries, which was really kind of a first pilot projects in the world, right? And pleasure to be at this PwC as such a great company to be in, where we can leverage the world global network, working across the different countries. So I have done projects from Singapore till Canada, working with really amazing colleagues to really get this done. Yeah, so very much happy to be here and discuss about some of the real world challenges and where this topic is heading.
Awesome. Well, I think what we're going to do here is, we discussed this beforehand, kind of planning this. Like, we want to discuss kind of this in three phases. I think the first phase we want to talk about is, challenges in adoption. Why, some of these networks are having a lot of problems with, kind of actually getting that real world implementation. And then we're going to lead into kind of the path towards mass adoption, whether it be corporate or enterprise or institutional. And then, we're going to kind of ramp out here with use cases that are actually driving that adoption. So, I mean, you've seen it all, as you've mentioned, across different jurisdictions and certainly different industry verticals. What are, your thoughts on kind of the challenges that a lot of these networks are facing right now? Because it seems like a no-brainer that, like, the technology the technology should be adopted way quicker. It's just, it's kind of a slow rolling thing. I'd love your thoughts on the challenges right now, Hussein.
Yeah, for sure. I think thanks for actually setting this as an agenda for this podcast, right? I think when we were planning this, we discussed like, okay, there are a number of podcasts out there, and how can we really bring, interesting topic for our listeners and your community here, right? And I think the real, boiling point at this point of time for the industry or enterprises is, when we go and speak with the client, the first question they ask, hey, we haven't seen any real world application so far. Can you give me a real example where a huge multinational company is using it? Do you have heard of this? Or do you have an example on your table? Probably you won't have the answer, right? What is really the reason? So if you really boil down, I will break it down, this question into a couple of ways, right? So the first and the foremost, what I have experienced firsthand in multiple companies is education. Really, it sounds super basic, but this is really the fundamental problem, right? Why? Let me give an example. First of all, we are talking about the technology. If you compare it, it is like internet protocol. How many times have you dealt, talking with the people about internet protocol,
Yeah,
right?
do I know right now TCP/IP? Do I know how the, like, no, nobody talks about it. We just use it.
Exactly. So you have always dealt with building on a website, building on kind of a chatbots, right? All of those what you can do with the internet. And I think this was really, I mean, when I started, working on this topic, I have done workshops with this explaining CXOs, what is blockchain, how does this thing work? And I always used to give an example as well, like, if you go and buy a car, Do you go into the details like how engine works, or you just decide whether it's a petrol or a diesel engine, right? And I think this is really the first thing, and I think this is really coming back to related to the topic of education, right? That people think it's super technical, but it is not. You don't need to go into the detail, but you need to understand what is really the potential of this technology and how it changes your business model. Because no matter how the good technology is, but if it doesn't apply in your business, it will not fly. And I think this education needs to be there, not only for the blockchain experts, but also for the business people. And I think this is really the bottleneck. First point. The second point is, if you see the journey of blockchain, right? I mean, tremendous last 10 years, how the Bitcoin and other, Ethereum and all the coins have flagged, and I mean, there are a number of ecosystems now available in the crypto space, right? DeFi, gaming, all of this, you name it, right? Real world tokenization. Why there is not a single, I mean, I have been working on a blockchain and supply chain use cases since 7 years now at PwC. I have done a number of blockchain and supply chain projects. I have done implementation projects as well, for the governments basically. And if you ask me why we don't see in a multinational company such a big implementation like SAP's or Microsoft of the world, and I think the real problem is there are two bubbles which runs parallel at the moment, right? One is really the blockchain bubble, so to say, where a lot of enthusiastic and a lot of companies really focus on this game-changing technology and how it can disrupt, and why this is really no-brainer for them. I understand it. It's completely fine. On the other hand, there is a really a pessimistic perspective, right? If you consider the companies, software companies who are really working on supply chain solutions, for example, they are on one hand afraid of getting into this blockchain space because they see it as cannibalizing their business. On the other hand, they are actually just not ready to accept this technology because they don't know how to fit this into the existing software. They are not really keeping this open mind. I have worked with number of software providers. So at the moment, those are two bubbles running parallel, but nobody have explored like, okay, what is really the subset possibilities of that, right? How can we bring those worlds together? And I think this is really where one of the challenging adoption lies, because companies are not going to change the way they run because of this new technology, right? So the startups and I think the ecosystem need to understand how to really work it in parallel and how to actually focus on this integration topic, right? So this is really where the bottleneck is. And I mean, those companies who have nailed it, you know, have actually, I have worked with one of the company who is really the leading pharma company in the world. They have really nailed it. Yeah, they understood all the mechanics, how to make it work, and how can we leverage the potential of this technology. And I think this is really the way it would be in the future, right? I mean, you don't need to just use this technology for the sake of using it, but what can we actually build it? Like, for example, if you're an existing business model, let me give you a concrete example. You can actually generate a pay-per-use business model using a token. So you keep all your business as it is and use your traditional technologies, but add token on it, right? Just an example. And I think this is the way you can solve it. And I think this is the understanding which is missing. This is second, actually the challenge in adoption.
Yeah. I'll touch briefly on a couple of things. You mentioned kind of the blockchain bubble, and then kind of the the bubble of traditional enterprise and infrastructure maybe being a little bit pensive about adopting it. For some context, like I remember back in 2021, you could go on to one of the aggregator sites. I think there was maybe 10 to 12,000 different digital assets on there. If you go to that same site right now, I think it's 20 million,
Yeah.
which is insane. So you can see that there's probably a 98%, just probably 99% nonsense, even more. The other thing is, and this is what I've heard a lot of times in a lot of these interviews, is that we need to do a much better job at meeting enterprise and institutions where they're at. They're not going to rip and replace all of their infrastructure just because this technology is great. I think value adding and leveraging the strengths of blockchain on top of what they already have is a much kind of better selling point. So in that vein, that kind of leads us into the path towards like mass adoption and real world use cases. Well, you and I talked about this before, like in crypto, if you're on crypto Twitter, everything has to be super sexy and new. But real world adoption looks very different. And I know that's one of your focuses from a sustainability standpoint, from a supply chain and digital twin standpoint, and product passports. What are some of the things that you're getting across the line with these enterprises and institutions that are actually kind of making sense to them and working?
Very, very good question, actually, Ryan. So I think you really hit the nail with those topics you just mentioned, right? So I think when it comes to the mass adoptions, um, there are really topics where more and more companies in this space are really focusing, which is really, for example, real world asset tokenization, right? This is real. I mean, you and me would be interacting, when we deal and buy real estate with the token. This is happening. You saw the news last week in Dubai. The Dubai government established blockchain labs, and with those labs established a few initial real estate properties. You can buy it with the token. I mean, this is happening, right? And I mean, this is no gimmicky. So I think this is really the full scale adoption that you can see over there. I mean, there are really the topics like digital product passport, right? I have seen and worked with the global institutions where we actually talked really for, we did the full business projects with them where we say, okay, how do you bring it to live? There are the topics, I think in the blockchain, we have been highlighting in a very beginning time that blockchain in industry only makes sense, when there are a number of companies involved in that. If there are two companies dealing, you don't need a blockchain. So I think these are really the examples like product passport, having the traceability, or having really the digital identity to understand who is really behind this, right? Those are the kind of examples or use cases which really value adds using this technology, because you don't know the third party. It is the element of trust, right? Trust is the key element here. Like, you know your suppliers, but you don't know your tier 4 suppliers. So is it really buying and there is no corruption over there? How can you ensure those things, right? And this is where this technology come into play. And I think when we are doing such projects, right, this is exactly the case where we actually realize that nobody's talking about blockchain. This is what we are really defining is how would we enable, the data sharing across the supply chain, because you're dealing with not one or two companies, but you're dealing with 150 companies in your supply chain, right? How do we ensure that data is really correct, that there is no garbage in or garbage out thing, so if you focus on those real topics and consider that blockchain is basically a single thread that you are using, yeah, I think this is where you can think of those mass adoptions. And I think, let me give you an example, with the product passport thing. If you consider the scale, what we are talking about, where we have 150 companies, and if we consider like the first element which is going to be launched, or according to the regulations which is required, is the battery passport for the EV vehicles, right? If you consider this value chain, there are like huge industries in play. So first is mining, right? Second is chemical. The third is, the battery manufacturers. The fourth is automotive, and the fifth is the recycling. So there are five completely different industry in play where you need to collect the data, and there is super competitive environment. So if you see the battery manufacturers based in China, they don't want to share with the OEMs based in Europe and in US basically, because they are more or less seeing them as a competitor, because all of the OEM also produce their own batteries, right? So how do you navigate this even if you use blockchain, right? And I think there are some really smart plays, which came from a strategic perspective. How we actually tackle during that is, we said, okay, why don't we actually find the best players in those each industry space? Because there is no one company or a blockchain company who is able to track, all across the fire industry. There is none, right? And I mean, you might have heard in your podcast visitors, as well as in hundreds of postcards, and where I also participated, asking me the question, hey, what do you think about private blockchain or a public blockchain? And I mean, those kind of question is already now gone, because I mean, it's like asking, are we using intranet or internet? No, we are using, I mean, simultaneously both. You don't even recognize, right? So I mean, similar, coming to this case of the battery, right? We said, okay, we select both the best players of blockchain in each industries, and then we bring together.
Yep.
And I think this is interoperability, not only between the traditional world technology and the blockchain, but also between the blockchain. And I think you need to really come up with those strategic ideas to match the reality. And I think this is kind of, things that each industry and each use cases needs to be tackled with in order to really have a successful mass adoption.
I think it ties a lot in with, when you, it's so interesting because right now we're kind of we're at this point where there's like all sorts of different technology converging. But you mentioned traditional companies, and even from a supply chain example, there's 150 different entities that touch, um, portions of, whatever different supply chain aspects. I think what's interesting there is if you include in the blockchain too, it's like really about like just making life cycle management of things much more efficient. Like from the inception of something or the origin of something, which gives you that provenance, which like obviously the blockchain can definitely give you, all the way to the delivery of something and the payment and the settlement of something. It's like it seems like I'm curious your take on this. This is like a little bit of a sidebar, but like we're starting to see, like I know in the UK, I think it was like maybe 2 years ago, the digital documentation law that came across. Like, where are we at right now as far as like making sure that different jurisdictions can support integration of the technology? Is it kind of like a catch up game to like to get kind of I'm not I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of regulatory clarity here and stuff like that, but traditional regulations like digital documentation and things like that stuff's definitely going to tie in. Like where are like what types of things can be implemented right now, and what types of things do you feel like there needs to be more work to do to implement solutions?
Again, a very good question, right? Because, for example, when I was doing a project with the gambling industry, we are dealing with the digital identities, which directly relates to the GDPR rule in Europe, right? Like, which says, okay, you need to delete a person identities within some time frame. So how do you deal it? Because I think if you store on a blockchain, it stays on the blockchain. So how do you navigate around those things, right? So I think the devil is in the details, to be honest, right? So I think, as I mentioned, you know, you need to focus on what is really the use case that you are actually executing, right? And then you need to think, okay, what are the regulations that you need to fulfill, like GDPR for identity, right? Some of the certificates that you need to do. And for example, if a certificate needs to be done by a specific a pharma company, right, they need to actually put the certificates. I mean, then they can actually store those certificates in their own cloud or server. You don't need to put those in the blockchain. However, you can create a kind of a digital identity or digital stamp of that document that it is there, and the trust can be put that, okay, the company has done this process or verified this, and this is enough for, providing the provenance.
Yeah.
And in other cases, like, if you consider a medicine, right, where you really need to see whether this is really a certificate or not, whether there is an authentic certificate, then what you can do is you can still put the certificate, but you can authorize. I mean, now you might have heard of zero knowledge proofs, and there are different identities, or mechanisms. I mean, you don't need a zero knowledge proof, because there is also an argument whether it's a successful way or not. But I think you have thousand ways of enabling that, okay, who sees what information,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, it's not that once you put on blockchain, it's all public, right? So you have a possibility that, only I can enable few entities or few specific, personnel to view this documentation. And I think this is particularly possible. And I think that document can still be in the local servers of the company. And I think these are really the ways you need to navigate. And I think, as I mentioned, first is the use case, and it's like onion layers, and then you go into the details, how would you do that?
I did an interview. I forget who it was with. It was like 3 weeks ago. But the guy brought up a really interesting point. He's like, I don't think we need any more general purpose blockchains. like,
Yeah.
like these kind of broad networks that are just like we can do everything. And it's like, okay, but one of the historical pain points with blockchain and distributed ledger is like not necessarily having product market fit. It's like, what are you doing really, really well that you can inject in? And I think you brought up something really good earlier too. Um, as far as to mention the DID stuff, like the W3C, basically who like governs the internet aspects, like there's like global bodies that are working on decentralized digital identifiers regardless. I want to kind of lead into, because I lost my old train of thought there, but like for different networks, because I know that you guys were at Davos earlier this year, and I know that you guys are working within the Hedera ecosystem for an accelerator surrounding sustainability. They have obviously the Guardian platform and some other stuff there. What are some areas that you find interesting, maybe within Hedera from a technology standpoint, and then even a few others that you find maybe interesting, just kind of in general? Some of these networks that are really have a focal point on certain aspects that you feel like kind of make sense.
Yes, glad that you brought this point. So I think with Hedera, we are working really on the topic of sustainability, which is at the moment, very much hot because of the incoming regulations. And I mean, as I already discussed about, one of the key use cases is the digital product passport, right? So digital product passport, we spoke quite a lot about the battery, but there are a number of regulations like textile, electronics. Those industries are also coming into the next 5 years in place. The regulations are coming in place, right? And also not to forget, a lot of products like palm oil, wood. So I think that also comes under the EUVR regulation. So it's basically the deforestation regulation where the suppliers need to prove how they procured those stuff. And I mean, what I have experienced with Hedera, they have a very sophisticated and a very simple and clean approach, right? As I was mentioning before, that you don't need to talk much about the technology, right? Because the business doesn't need to understand the technology. And I think I have worked on multiple, opportunities with them where they had a very clean approach where we can explain to the CXO, like, okay, that's the thing how you work. So I think this is really going to be a key game changing element or use case for Hedera, to be honest, along. And that's why we are working also with them to enable those supply chain use cases. So I mean, it's a big topic of digital product passport, but there are a number of regulations which you can solve, under this umbrella. So I think there is EUDR, right? There is EUBR, so better regulation. Then there is EU Green Deal, right? There are reporting compliance. So I think depending on how, I mean, there is no one size fit all, right? I think depending on the size of the company, what they want to do, where they stand, what is really the current existing IT infrastructure, we can enable that and define how we can solve this particular technology, because I think the key bottom line is how do we enable the whole ecosystem and the value chain to get on board and have this data transparency. Let me make a concrete example just to give, like, okay, I spoke a little bit of a higher words or complex words about it, but I had a discussion along with Hedera with one company where we said, okay guys, all of this is nice, but why can't I use my existing cloud? I mean, this is not a rocket science, right? I mean, it's a traceability. I need data from my suppliers. I know my suppliers. Why are you making these things complex? And then I asked only one simple question. You go and ask your tier 4 supplier, and you mention this, that this is the data you need. And just check with them. And the first question they will ask, to whom should I actually give the data? Who is the owner of that data? And if you say, okay, it's you ask if they are happy to share the data, for a longer duration of time. Do they trust you? And they said, yeah, that's not going to happen. Even we have problems with our tier 1 and tier 2. And I think that's the answer, right? I said, you need a decentralized storage where everybody actually can actually trust themselves and put the data, and they are 100% sure that, this is not being misused. And then and only then, this links back to your question of mass adoption, right? This is also one of the key aspects of this is really the human aspect of it, I would say, that you always have a fear that, okay, am I cannibalizing my business, right? So that's exactly the layer that you're using, to do that. So that's the one thing around the sustainability, right? The second point or the second use case, which I find super, super, super interesting is trade finance.
Yeah.
This is where we bring banks and supply chain together. I think this is really where I see massive, massive potential in the upcoming years. I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean, I've done plenty of interviews in kind of the trade finance lens as well. And there's, for those that aren't aware, you'd be hard pressed to get an official statistic, but there's like a $3 to $5 trillion trade finance gap that exists out there in the world right now. And essentially, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, have a much harder time getting funding or participating in the trade finance process comparative to like some of the bigger entities out there. We talk about democratizing access into these systems. That's a huge industry right there. That's totally going to be changed. And not only from SMEs participating or getting financing, but individuals participating in the trade finance aspect is going to be really interesting as well. I wanted to bring up an example with you though, Hussein, because I come from a heavy manufacturing background as a project manager, and I just remember like traceability of let's use carbon and stainless steel plate for an example. for those that aren't aware, there's like a huge issue with authenticity around, especially like hardware, and then even like stainless and carbon plate, to the point that like imagine manufacturing nuclear casks, because that's what I used to do. You have to essentially make sure that you have traceability of every single component that goes into a spent fuel cask. And you think about all the manual processes that go into making sure that you have that verification, number one, let alone the fact that when you have like plate, like stainless and carbon plate sitting in a warehouse, it's literally written like in Sharpie on the plate, like the identification number, like the mill number is like stamped on it. And you bring up an interesting point with it, which is like, I need the data for this plate. I'm going to go to my equipment supplier. Well, I don't have the original data for that plate. I've got to go back to the mill. The mill has to go to a batch number, then has to go to a lot number, and all this other stuff. It is a whirlwind of, and we think about why stuff fails in the real world,
Yeah.
why cars fail, why aviation and planes fail. Like, these are the reasons why. So like, we need that level of authenticity without even being able to have to trust a person that's behind the data, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you brought a really good point, right? And I think let me give you two basic example which we use on day-to-day life, right? Because we talk a lot about the bigger companies and everything, but how it is, why it would come in our daily day-to-day life. So in Germany, I'm living in Germany since many years now, and I mean here we have in all the supermarkets a huge focus on the bio products, right? So if you buy a normal banana, it costs you like few cents. If you buy a bio banana, it costs you like a couple of euros, or Um, so at the moment, you just trust a sticker over there that it's a bio product, right? And you trust the brand where you're buying from. But I mean, more and more bioproducts now you see in the plastic packaging that they are starting to create a journey. So if you see like a fair trade products, they just now have a website giving a history. But that's it. In future, not in future also, in next 2 to 5 years, you will see the whole journey of it. Like, okay, where is this banana, farm? Where is this coming from? How did it travel to you? I mean, this is giving you a trust, and that's why you are paying more. I mean, couple of supermarkets like Walmart, right, in China, they have also kind of a bio product line. They are already doing it today, right? I mean, it's similar case for all the luxury products. I mean, you see like all the famous brands, Prada, Louis Vuitton, right? I think you are paying a ton of money, and this is exactly what you're going to see, whether it's really authentic product or not.
Yep.
Next example is medicine. I mean, there is no regulation for the pharma industry, right? There is no product passport for the pharma industry, but this is the biggest industry where you see the counterfeiting in the world. I mean, how many fake medicine are being sold? I mean, look at also the COVID vaccines, right? There was a case of billions, not in Asia, but in Europe, in Spain, right? I mean, billions of vaccines was actually fake vaccines, right? So these are the kind of examples that you will see the full traceability, and I think this is going to be the game changing. So it's just a matter of time, as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, right? Like education, right? If once people start understanding the benefit of it, you don't want to use blockchain just to do the traceability. But for example, I worked with a pharma company. They said, okay, why can't we use to track the feedback from the cancer patient? Because there is no software solution, which I can use for getting a feedback from a cancer patient.
Yeah.
What is really the app, right? I mean, what is really the technology, right? And I think this is really the way you actually capture the information from multiple companies, and not only companies but also the individuals. And I think this is the only way you will do it, right? And I think these are the examples, where we see really potential. And I think this is where also we are working with Hedera multiple cases, right? Not only focusing on sustainability, but also trade finance in a way is called trade finance use cases, but it is a major, major, major sustainability case,
Yeah. I think,
right?
yeah. And I think, I've done a few interviews from through like the sustainability lens too. And I know that like greenwashing and things like that are a big issue in
Yeah,
that industry traditionally. And I think it's an interesting point because I don't think a lot of people realize that like global entities have milestones at different time frames for where they need to be through a sustainability and an ESG lens. 2025, if I remember correctly, was a decently large year. I know 2030 is a huge year. You can go all the way out to 2050, and it's like, my head goes towards, it's not the discussion is going to shift from, it's nice to have these things, it's nice to have this transparency, it's nice to have this provenance, to it is mandated to have these things
Yeah.
in place that you can actually trace this. Am I correct in that assumption? And what are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. So as I mentioned, I already named a couple of regulations that comes into place, but I think there is going to be also changes in the way you work, right? The way the company functions today, because I think this is really some of the processes. Let me give you an example because I don't want to talk a lot about the sustainability regulations, but real sustainability examples, right? If you send a container from Australia to Netherlands, can you imagine how much of paper you need to send along with that container that goes on a post?
It's a lot.
It's a lot, right? And I think that paper needs to be in each port it goes to, otherwise it is not shipped further.
Yep.
So if you actually digitalize and put this paper on a blockchain, you will save 10% of your container transit cost. So if a container shipping costs $2,000, you save $200 on just digitalizing this paper. I mean, the question is, why can't you send a PDF? I mean, people are not stupid. Why is it not working? And there was a case, multi-million or even $1 billion fraud where people, I mean, in a company with a scale of 10,000 or million transactions per day, you're not able to track the PDFs. And I think this is exactly the case what happened, in the companies, that there were double booking frauds that was happening when they were sending those documents as a PDF. And they said, okay, there is no way if there is a company having a million transactions per day that they are able to track million PDFs. How do you do it? And I think these are really the concrete and super, super, super basic examples, right? Where it's a paper, so it's a directly a sustainable case, right? You save time, you save money, and you have 90% efficiency gain
Yep.
because you can actually transit this document in a seconds. So I think these are the cases where companies need to focus, and I think this is going to be the game changing and leading to this mass adoption rather than having a real sustainability use case which will change the world. I mean, that's not. I mean, it's really starting from the basics and then going onwards. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Back during 2020, I can remember. I brought this example up before. We used to estimate, I think, 5 to 7 weeks lead time if we were having goods shipped from China into the U.S. At my company. And there was a time in 2020 that legitimately you could not get a lead time. Like I remember we used to have parts fabricated by like Honeywell a bunch, and Honeywell wouldn't even give you a date for when their stuff was going to ship. Number one, but we think about the issue with customs. Like a lot of people don't realize this. There's still legislation that goes back to the late 1800s for a hand signed bill of lading for stuff to clear customs. And I think about like the small mom and pop shops that are that are waiting for parts and like the downwind effects of just how this, how inefficient some of this stuff is. But no, I mean, there's so many use cases we could get into. I want to ask you, as we kind of lead out here, and I really appreciate your time today, Hussein. As I told you, we could probably have done easily an hour in this, but I know we want to follow up with another one in the future. Where do you feel like we're at right now with adoption of the technology? I use the acronym of a base or the I'll use the example of a baseball game. If we were in a baseball game, what inning were we in, or are we not even up to bat yet? And what are you excited about for the future within PwC or the wider space?
Yeah, so I mean, normally what we use always is a ESCO, right? I think this is a very famous terminology where we say, okay, the ESCO meaning like when it goes mainstream. So if you see like the Facebooks of the Facebook history or the iPhone histories, right? Where in the time of 2005 or six, or this is where the Facebook and iPhones were launched, right? In the 2007s, and the time it hits to reach like a billion users, right? If you see today how many crypto users are in the world, it's roughly 400, 500 million users, right? But this is really crypto related, like how many people are trading tokens, but not really the enterprise. It's a good question. I think this week in the beginning of the week we also discuss in other conference like, okay, what do you think is a good time? Where do we stand on that? So I think answer is I see still as a time frame for 5 to 10 years, roughly, at least. The reason is, as I mentioned, this real world mass scale implementation needs really this integration topics, understanding of those things. And I think these topics we are speaking since 5 years, it's not new, right? But I think as I gave an examples with sustainability, because things are now changing. So the external landscape is changing, not the technology landscape, that as you mentioned, that it's not anymore nice to have, but a must have. And I think there are use cases where we don't talk anymore about blockchain, as I mentioned about the digital product passport, right? But how to get those things done. And everything at the back is actually run on those, and then integration is being laid upon that. And I think in order to have those multiple use cases, I think this is why I think there is a very clear focus from Hedera Hashgraph Association as well to focus on sustainability, because at the moment is a kind of a starting point, that it becomes a mandatory. And I think companies need to understand, and they are actually very smartly also developing the whole ecosystem around it. As we just mentioned, that it's not only blockchain, but we need, plus one technology and minus one technology also together with it, right? And I think this is exactly what Hedera is also enabling. And I think this is what I see, is a kind of appropriate time frame when it relates to the use cases. I think digital product passport is one of them, right? The second one, what I really see is the AI, right? I mean, AI is a super big topic, but I mean, at the moment, I'm also developing a specific AI demo, right? But the key question we said, okay, how can you trust the data of AI?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? I mean, if AI is giving you a recommendation, so how do you enable and ensure that, can you make business decision based on AI,
Yep.
right? When it comes to the business decision, you need some kind of an surety that you can trust the data. And I think again, this trust element will come from the blockchain technologies, but I think this needs to be further, researched upon, like how do you do that? But I think not really from a technical perspective, but rather from a business perspective. So I think this is going to be, a big another topic in upcoming years, which will also take it to the mass adoption.
100%. I mean, the agentic AI stuff, you brought up the example of a company can't go through a million PDFs a
Yeah.
day. That's, I would imagine in the future that agentic AI plays some sort of a role in that, but you better damn well make sure that AI is managing the data appropriately through the training models. What I want to lead out with this real quick. The one thing that there was a guy like 4 or 5 months ago that put out a post about like why are all these dinosaur networks and blockchain populating my feed, referencing like Hedera and some of the other networks that have been here for 5 or 6 years. And I found it so comical because like what we're talking about right now is like real world enterprise and real world industry. And what I've seen is that it takes, to value add on top of those industries, it takes a lot of trust building, and it takes the technology just working. So those types of relationships take 4 or 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, we could probably go into the banking lens in the next one too, because I find it super interesting. Like those types of proof of concepts were going on for 4 or 5, 6 years before any sort of real world implementation was going on. So I found that to be a comical thing that a guy posted on Twitter, and I just found it a little bit obtuse and like ignorant about what's actually going on. But I certainly appreciate all your wealth of knowledge today, Hussein. And where can people go to learn a little bit more about the work that you're doing, or where would you recommend them to, educate themselves a little bit more on what we talked about today?
So very good question. I think today, I think it's also the knowledge is decentralized, right? I think there are a number of courses available, online course and everything, right? But I think the key thing, I keep myself updated is via LinkedIn profiles, right? So I think this is where a lot of experts I follow, kind of a leading experts of the world, what they're up to. I also follow, the World Economic Forum documentation, which they're working with number of companies over there. And of course, you can visit our website. I have also written many white papers, right? And I think it really depends on what level of knowledge you are looking at the moment, right? So I think the advanced level, you need to definitely follow some of the key personalities on LinkedIn, to be honest, really to understand what they're up to stay really updated. Also, I would say there are a couple of websites I specifically follow, like Supply Chain 24/7, which is like a blockchain related supply chain news all the time. So you already see like, okay, very specific to the space, right? I also have a team who does like a market research, right? So I think this is how we also stay updated. I think it's, to be honest, today's age, there is no one source of truth where you say, okay, here's where I can go. I think it would be like a multiple ways you can actually follow on multiple consulting companies who have written white papers and thought leadership papers, right? Just to get on this topic, right, and understand different perspective, right? Because if you speak with another person, they would have a completely different perspective on this topic. So I think you need to decide, and learn about this topic from multiple perspectives. So I do the same, right, to understand who are my competitors, what they are working on, what are really the big leading tech companies doing in, what are really the trends, and how I can relate this topic, example of the AI, right? Also thinking and of the quantum computing. I think there are really nice papers out there on the quantum computing and can actually cannibalize the blockchain innovations, right? And I think those are really the aspect that you can get into it. And I think then you need to decide which you find interesting. Is it enterprise blockchain or a finance aspect of it? And then you will find always like deeper dives on the specific topics. And I think once you go into the detail, you will always find, right person or on the social media. Yeah.
Well, I certainly appreciate your time today. Again, Husen Kapasi, PwC Europe blockchain lead. I want to give a huge shout out to the Hashgraph Association and for helping us to put this together. A lot of interesting discussions during this one. We definitely want to have you back in the near future. I think that we could definitely fill another hour here. So looking forward to that. Hang out with me here for 1 second as I ramp this down to make sure I get the recording. And thank you to our audience for listening today.